Before we begin, I need you to do something for me right now. Drop a comment with your country and the exact time you are watching this. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Toronto, or evening in Paris, tell me, are you watching alone or is someone beside you? Because this story is about to hit you in a place you were not expecting, and I want to know exactly who felt it. Don't just watch, be part of this. Now, let's dive in. There is a sound a child makes when a grown man's hand hits her body hard enough to lift her off the earth. It is not a scream. A scream requires preparation, a sharp breath inward, a tensing of the throat. This sound has no preparation. It is the short, wet exhale of air being forced out of a small chest that did not know impact was coming. That was the sound 8-year-old Nettie Calloway made when Garrett Slade, the most powerful cattle rancher in the Bighorn Valley, drove his open palm into her back and launched her off her feet in the middle of Ridgewater's main road. She hit the dirt face first. Her basket of eggs exploded beneath her body, the yellow yolk splitting and bleeding into the brown dust like something alive dying slowly. Her cotton dress tore at the shoulder. Her lower lip cracked against a stone half buried in the road, and blood ran down her chin and dripped into the earth, and the earth swallowed it without ceremony. She was 8 years old, 52 pounds, and the man standing above her, 210 pounds of cattle money and unchecked cruelty, was smiling. Not grinning, smiling. The particular smile of a man who believes the world exists to confirm his authority. The townspeople of Ridgewater lined the wooden sidewalks like figures carved from the same frightened wood. The baker held his tray of morning rolls at chest height and did not lower it. The schoolteacher stood on her porch with both hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide, her feet cemented to the boards. The blacksmith rested his hammer on the anvil and looked at the ground. 3 women pulled their children behind their skirts, shielding them from the sight the way you shield a match from wind, instinctively, uselessly. The deputy sheriff leaned against a post 10 yards away, picked a splinter from his thumbnail, and watched the scene with the professional disinterest of a man who had been paid to see nothing. Not one person stepped into the road, not one voice rose above the silence. Because Garrett Slade owned 90% of the valley's grazing land, controlled the only year-round water source, held the sheriff's loyalty, the judge's debt, and the bank's cooperation. Opposing Garrett did not mean losing an argument. It meant losing water. And losing water meant losing cattle, crops, income, and eventually the land itself. So, the town watched. And the town did what it always did. Absolutely nothing. Garrett looked down at the child in the dirt and spat close, enough to her hand that she flinched. "You tell your mama," he said, his voice a low, grinding rasp that scraped the silence like rusted iron on stone, "that the next time she sends you across my path carrying those eggs, I will make you eat every shell." He turned and walked toward his horse at the end of the road, his ranch hands falling in step behind him, one of them muttering something that made the others laugh. A few townsmen tipped their hats as he passed, reflexively, the way dogs roll onto their backs when something bigger enters the room. A woman steered her daughter's face away from the road. The rest simply waited for the moment to end the way they waited for hailstorms, with their doors shut and their eyes on the floor. Nettie lay in the dirt. She did not cry out. She did not scream. She lay perfectly still and looked up at the space where Garrett had been, and her eyes, gray, wide, steady as creek water, held something that did not belong on a way. Child's face. It was not fear. It was the look of someone memorizing a debt. Then, Cora Calloway came around the corner of the dry goods store. She saw Nettie in the road. She saw the broken eggs. She saw the blood on her daughter's chin. And what happened to Cora's face in that moment was something the people of Ridgewater would carry in their memories until they died. She was thin, dark-haired, pale from years of winters that gave more than they took, wearing a dress patched at both elbows and boots with no laces. She looked like a woman the prairie wind could fold in half. But when she saw her daughter bleeding in the dirt, something ignited behind her eyes that turned her entire body into a different substance, harder, hotter, more dangerous than anything the town had ever seen standing on 2 legs. She ran. She dropped to her knees. She pulled Nettie into her chest with a force that looked like she was trying to push the girl back inside her own body, past the skin and the ribs and the hammering heart, into some chamber so deep that no man's hand could ever reach it. "You all saw that," she said, her voice cracked but unbroken. "Every single one of you." The town looked away, but Cora had a secret that none of them knew. Not the baker, not the deputy, not the sheriff who wore his badge like a decoration bought with someone else's money. 20 miles up the mountain, past the timberline where the pines gave way to bare rock, past the elk meadows, past the last twisted bristlecones that clung to the cliff face like fists refusing to let go, there was a cabin, built from lodgepole pine and river stone by hands that could split a man's jaw as easily as they split firewood. Inside that cabin lived a man who had not come down in 10 years, a man who had once cleared a saloon by walking through the door, a man whose name had been whispered in 3 territories the way people whisper about weather that kills. His name was Josiah Calloway, 6'4", 240 pounds of mountain-hardened silence. He had walked away from the world because the world kept making him do things that the world then punished him for. The girl in the dirt, the one with the split lip and the blood on her chin and the bruise already blooming on her shoulder like a dark flower, was his daughter. And a letter was about to climb the mountain. 9 years before Nettie's face hit the dirt, a 20-year-old woman named Cora Bellamy was walking north through the canyons of Wyoming with a leather satchel on her back and nothing behind her worth returning to. She had buried her mother at 14. Typhoid moved through her body in 3 days and left nothing but a wooden box and a Bible on the nightstand. She buried her father at 17 under a mountain that collapsed on 9 men in a mine shaft and returned none of them. She buried her aunt at 19, her last living relative, a woman who substituted turpentine for whiskey, and slipped out of the world on a Tuesday morning so quietly that no one noticed until Thursday. There was nothing left in the mining town of Sulphur Bluff except dust, debt, and the particular silence of a place that has outlived its reason for existing. So Cora packed a wool blanket, a hunting knife, a tin cup, and her mother's Bible. She walked north. She slept under rock overhangs. She ate what she could trap. She had no destination. She had the stubborn, burning refusal to stop moving that she had inherited from a woman who died whispering 2 words through cracked lips. Keep going. On the 6th day, the sky turned the color of a bruise, and the mountain tried to kill her. A storm hit the canyon with a violence that felt personal, wind that ripped trees from the soil, rain that turned the trail into a moving river of mud and shale. The wind caught Cora's body and threw her 30 feet down a slope that shredded her clothes and opened her skin. She landed at the bottom. With a sound she heard inside her own skull. 2 ribs cracked. Her left ankle twisted until the bone pressed against the skin from the inside, straining to break through like something trapped trying to escape. She crawled under a fallen pine and lay there for 2 days, shivering so violently her teeth chipped, listening to the rain punish the earth and the animals circle in the dark, the wet pad of a cougar on stone, the crack of something heavy on a branch above her. Her body dimmed. The oil ran low. She drifted between consciousness and a darkness that felt like a waiting room. She whispered to the mountain because God had stopped taking her messages years ago. Let me live. I am not finished yet. On the 2nd night, she heard footsteps, human, heavy, deliberate, coming straight toward her with the certainty of someone who already knew where she was. A shape materialized through the rain, enormous, dark, blocking the last gray light in the sky the way an eclipse blocks. The sun. A man. The largest human she had ever seen. 6'4", shoulders wider than the fallen tree hiding her, a beard that was black and silver, like lightning frozen in dark wood. His coat was elk hide, stitched with sinew, heavy and scarred, hanging from his frame like armor grown from the mountain itself. He carried no gun, only an axe, riding his back on a leather strap worn silk smooth from a decade of daily use. He crouched beside her. The ground compressed under his weight. He said one word, "Breathe." It entered her broken ribs and vibrated there, low, warm, resonant, like a bell struck at the bottom of a well. He slid his arms under her body and lifted her as if gravity had agreed to look the other way. She lost consciousness against his chest. The last thing she registered was his heartbeat, slow and steady as a drum keeping time for the earth itself. His name was Josiah. He carried her up the mountain for 3 hours through rain and blackness without pausing, without stumbling, without his breathing changing from the calm, measured cadence of a man who had carried heavier things than a broken woman up steeper trails than this. The cabin sat above the timberline on a shelf of rock overlooking a valley so vast the far side dissolved into blue haze. Inside, a wood stove radiating warmth into every corner, a rope bed layered with elk hides, shelves of dried venison and jarred huckleberries, and bundles of sage hanging from the ceiling like green prayers drying in the heat. He set her ribs with willow bark and rawhide. He brewed a tea that tasted like earth and honey and forgetting. For 3 weeks he spoke fewer than 10 words per day. But every morning she woke to a fire already burning, water boiled, a plate of roasted roots and venison waiting beside the bed. She watched him move through the cabin like silence was a sacrament, and he was its most devoted practitioner. He handled every object, the kettle, the axe, the firewood, the door, with a gentleness that seemed learned rather than natural, the gentleness of hands that had once broken something irreplaceable and had spent years teaching themselves to be careful. By the 4th week, she could walk. By the 6th, leaving felt like a kind of death. One night, the fire breathing low, stars crowding the window glass, she asked why he lived alone above the world. He watched the flames for so long, the silence became its own answer. Then he spoke, barely louder than the crackle of the wood. Because the last time I lived among people, 3 of them died under my hands, and when it was over, my hands were steady. She didn't pull away. She did not flinch. She reached across the space between them and laid her hand on top of his. His hand was scarred across every knuckle, hard as the stone he had used to build these walls, and it dwarfed hers the way a boulder dwarfs a leaf. He looked at her hand like it was a phenomenon that violated the laws of his universe, something soft and warm and alive, resting on a weapon without fear. They fell in love the way snow falls on a mountain, slowly at first, individual flakes dissolving on warm ground, and then all at once, until the entire landscape was transformed, and nothing underneath would ever look the same. But even love carries an echo on a mountain this quiet, and echoes, given enough time, always reach the valley. Nettie was born in that cabin on a night when the wind held its breath, and the stars burned so bright they looked like the sky had cracked and the light behind it was leaking through. Josiah held his daughter for the first time, and came apart. Not quietly, not with dignity. With the full shuddering collapse of a man who had spent a decade mortaring shut every opening inside himself and had just felt every seal blow simultaneously. She was impossibly small. Her fingers found his thumb and locked around it with a certainty that said, "I have been looking for this." He pressed his forehead to hers and inhaled milk, warmth, new skin, the sharp, sweet scent of a life that nothing cruel had ever touched. He made a silent promise. No one would ever hurt her. It was the kind of promise a man makes before he understands the cost of keeping it, the kind that sleeps peacefully inside the chest until the day it wakes up armed with teeth and claws and a willingness to destroy whatever stands in its way. 6 months later, Cora said the words Josiah had been dreading. She needs people, Josiah, a school, a doctor, a world. Josiah could not argue. He could only decline to follow. The man I was is sleeping, he said. If he wakes up near her, I will never forgive myself. So Cora carried Nettie down the mountain. Josiah watched until the trees swallowed them. Then he sat at the empty table for 2 days without moving. Ridgewater met them with indifference and suspicion in equal measure. Cora rented a 1-room shack at the edge of town for twice the fare. Price, because the landlord saw a woman alone with an infant and smelled leverage. She took in laundry. She mended clothes. She raised 3 chickens in a mud yard and sold the eggs for pennies. The women of Ridgewater whispered about her with a cruelty they mistook for curiosity. The mountain woman, they called her, speculating about Nettie's father in voices calibrated to carry exactly far enough. A dead trapper, a fugitive. Something darker, they mouthed, but would not say aloud. Nettie grew up fast and watchful. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes, eyes that absorbed more than they revealed, that made schoolteachers uneasy and old ranchers nod with reluctant respect. She was strong for her age, quiet by choice rather than temperament, and observant in a way that bordered on unsettling. She noticed the shopkeeper shorting her mother's flour. She noticed the women crossing the street when Cora approached. She noticed that every man in Ridgewater lowered his gaze when a certain horse passed. Nettie did not lower hers. She did not know yet that this was dangerous. She only knew it was wrong. The man on the horse was Garrett Slade, and understanding what he had done to Ridgewater required watching him do it. Cora saw it firsthand 6 months before the day in the road. She was standing in the doorway of her shack feeding Nettie breakfast when she heard a woman screaming on the road. It was Elda Mercer, a widow whose husband had died the previous winter, standing in front of Garrett's foreman with a piece of paper shaking in her hand. The paper was a lien. Garrett had filed it on Elda's Creekside property, 40 acres her family had worked for 20 years, claiming she owed back payments on water access. The amount was invented. The debt was fabricated. But the signature at the bottom was the territorial judge's, and the judge belonged to Garrett the way a saddle belongs to the man who bought it. Elda was sobbing. The foreman waited with the patience of a man who had done this before. Garrett himself sat on his horse 20 feet away, watching the scene with the detached satisfaction of a man watching an animal walk into a trap he had set. He did not speak. He did not need to. Within a week, Elda signed over the property. Within a month, she was gone. Cora watched the whole thing from her doorway and understood with perfect clarity the kind of town she had brought her daughter into. Ridgewater was not governed by law. It was governed by appetite, one man's appetite, fed by water rights he had monopolized and a network of debts and threats and silent agreements that made resistance impossible and obedience mandatory. Every farmer depended on Garrett's spring-fed creek. Every merchant depended on the farmers. Every official depended on Garrett's money. It was a closed system, a machine designed to produce one outcome: Garrett Slade's comfort and everyone else's: compliance. Cora saw it clearly because she was an outsider, and outsiders see the shape of a cage that the people inside it have stopped noticing. She also saw that she and Nettie were now inside the cage, with no money, no allies, no name that carried weight, and a landlord who could double her rent on a whisper from the man on the horse. She held Nettie tighter that morning. She did not cry. She had given that up years ago. But that night, for the first time, she stood at the window and looked up at the mountain and let herself think the thought she had been holding back since she walked down the trail. Maybe I should not have left. The war started with a gunshot. Cora's chickens wandered onto a strip of grass near Garrett's cattle pen, public land before Garrett moved his fence posts 20 feet east, while the town pretended not to notice. He did not shoot the birds. He pulled his rifle from the scabbard, sighted a hen from 15 feet, and fired. The blast cracked through, the morning air like the world splitting open. Nettie screamed from inside the shack, a scream so high and so raw that the neighbor's dog howled in response. Cora came running and found Garrett standing over the dead bird, smoke curling from his barrel, wearing a smile that made every nerve in her body vibrate with the effort of not throwing herself at his throat. "Keep your animals off my land," he said. "Next time, it will not be a chicken." After that, the cruelties came in sequence, each one precise, each one designed to tighten the noose by one more notch. He froze her credit at the general store. He had Nettie expelled from school. He doubled her rent. He told the churchwomen that Cora carried shame like a disease. Every night, after Nettie fell asleep, Cora stood at the window and stared at the invisible mountain and mouthed 2 words into the dark. Not yet. 12 letters sat in a tin box under the floorboards. 12 letters Cora had written to Josiah over 9 years and never sent. Each one sealed with candle wax, addressed to J, holding the milestones of a daughter he was missing, her first word, spoken with a fat finger pointed at the pine outside the window. Tree. Her first steps, aimed at the chicken coop, ending face first in the mud, followed by laughter so consuming that Cora sat down beside her and laughed until her stomach ached. Her first fight, at school, where she broke a boy's nose for calling her a word no child should know, and then sat calmly in the corner while the teacher sent for Cora, her knuckles red and her expression utterly unrepentant. The letters told him about winters that cracked the walls and a roof that leaked into a tin bucket Nettie had named Harold. They told him about a town that treated them like something tracked in on the bottom of a boot, but every letter ended with the same 6 words. We are fine. I will handle it. 12 times Cora had written that sentence, 12 lies sealed, in wax and buried under the floor, because sending a letter meant admitting she had failed, and admitting that meant admitting every humiliation she had survived had been purchased for nothing. The night Garrett threw Nettie into the dirt, the 13th letter wrote itself. Cora carried her daughter home, cleaned the blood from her lip with a warm cloth, bandaged the scrape on her knee, and put her to bed with a story about a princess who lived in a castle built from clouds. Nettie's eyes closed. Cora sat on the edge of the mattress and looked at the bruise forming on her daughter's shoulder. It was the color of a storm approaching, purple at the center, darkening at the edges, and it was shaped like a hand, 5 fingers pressed into the skin of a child. Cora stared at it until the candle burned to a stub and the room filled with the kind of darkness that presses against your face. Then she walked to the kitchen table, sat down, took a fresh piece of paper, dipped her pen in ink, and wrote 3 sentences. Garrett Slade put his hands on our daughter. She has a cut on her lip and a bruise on her shoulder shaped like his hand. I cannot protect her alone anymore. She read them back 3 times. Each reading hammered the words deeper, like nails driven into hardwood. She sealed the envelope. She did not bury it under the floor. She put it in her coat. She found Orrin Finch at the edge of town, sitting on his family's fence, watching stars the way lonely children do when the ground has run out of things worth watching. Orrin was 14. The son of a trapper who froze to death 2 winters ago, thin and fast and intelligent in the particular way of boys raised by the wilderness, not book smart, but survival smart, able to read a trail the way other boys read a page. He was the only child in Ridgewater who looked Cora in the eye without looking away first. She gave him the letter and $2 silver, 3 months of careful saving. Up the mountain, past the timberline, past the elk meadow, a cabin made of pine and stone. Leave it on the porch. Do not knock. Do not wait. Do not let him see you. Orrin studied her face, saw something in it that made questions unnecessary, and took the letter without a word. He vanished into the trees before the last light left the sky. The trail nearly killed him twice. A shelf of shale gave way and dropped him 30 feet before a root saved his grip, and a cougar followed him for an hour through the timber, close enough that he could hear its breath and count its footfalls. He reached the cabin at dawn on the 2nd day. It materialized through the mist like a door cut into the mountainside, solid, weathered, perfectly placed on a shelf of rock above the clouds. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin gray thread. He placed the letter on the porch, weighted it with a smooth stone, and turned to run. 10 steps. Boy! The voice came from behind him, so deep it seemed to originate not from a throat, but from the rock beneath the cabin. Orrin turned and saw Josiah Calloway in the doorway, filling it completely, massive, bearded, gray-eyed, his hands hanging at his sides like tools designed for one purpose and repurposed for another. He picked up the letter. He studied the handwriting. He opened the envelope with fingers that had suddenly lost their composure. He read the 3 sentences once, twice, 3 times. Each reading rearranged his face, confusion, then recognition, then something Orrin would later describe as the expression a mountain wears right before it becomes an avalanche. Josiah folded the letter with the precision of a man folding a flag and placed it in his shirt pocket directly above his heart. The clearing went still. The wind stopped. The ravens landed on the rocks. Even the mist seemed to hold its position. Go home, Josiah said. His voice was quiet in the way that deep water is quiet, not because there is nothing happening, but because everything happening is beneath the surface where you cannot see it and cannot stop it. Tell no one, Oren ran. He ran down that mountain as if the mountain itself were chasing him, his feet barely touching the trail, his heart punching against his ribs. He did not look back. He could feel the shift behind him, not Josiah, but something geological, tectonic, the feeling of a massive weight that had been stationary for a decade beginning to move. Back at the cabin, Josiah sat on the porch until the sun bled out of the sky and the valley below went black. He did not eat. He did not drink. He was not still. He was holding himself still. The distinction mattered. A boulder on a slope is still. A man sitting on a lit fuse is holding himself still. Inside his chest, the thing he had spent 10 years sedating was now fully awake, pressing against his ribs, testing the architecture of his restraint. He thought about Nettie's grip on his thumb the day she was born. He thought about the bruise described in 3 sentences of shaking ink, shaped like a man's hand on the shoulder of an 8-year-old girl. He stood up and went inside the cabin and opened a trunk he had not touched in a decade. Inside the trunk, folded beneath a wool blanket and a stack of yellowed newspapers, was the wardrobe of a dead man. That was how Josiah thought of these clothes, the skin of the man he had killed when he climbed this mountain 10 years ago. Black leather boots, still oiled, still supple, patient as loyal animals that had never stopped expecting their master to return. A duster coat the color of storm clouds 1 shade before lightning, heavy and long, designed for a body that took up more space than most rooms were built to hold. A wide-brimmed hat with a silver band that caught the firelight and threw it back like a small defiance against the dark. A Bowie knife with a bone handle, the grip worn to a polish by years of use, fitting his hand, not like a tool but like an extension of his skeleton. And at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth that still smelled faintly of gun oil, a Colt revolver. He picked up the gun. The cylinder was empty. The weight was familiar, not just in his palm but in his nervous system, lighting up old pathways he had spent a decade letting go dark. He held the weapon for a long time. Then he placed it back in the trunk and closed the lid. No gun. A gun was faster than regret. The knife required closeness, and closeness required a choice, and choices were the only leash that still worked on the thing inside him. But before he dressed, before he laced the boots or buckled the blade, he sat at the table and did something he had not done since the night Cora left the mountain. He spoke out loud, to himself, to the other man, the fighter, the killer, the thing coiled behind his ribs that he had been feeding silence and solitude for 10 years, the way you feed a dangerous animal just enough to keep it sleeping. "You do not decide," Josiah said, his voice filling the empty cabin. "I decide when you wake. I decide when you move. I decide when you stop. You do not get to choose. Not this time." His words sounded like a prayer stitched to a threat. He sat for an hour, building the internal architecture he would need, walls, doors, locks, each one placed with the deliberate care of a man who knows that what he is containing could destroy everything he is walking toward. He was not going to Ridgewater as the man the territories had whispered about. He was going as a father whose daughter had been hurt and whose daughter's voice had been stolen. There was a difference between those 2 men. Josiah needed there to be a difference. His life depended on there being a difference. He dressed at dawn. The boots fit like they had been counting the days. The coat settled onto his shoulders with the familiarity of a second skin that remembered him better than he remembered it. The knife rode his hip with the comfortable weight of an argument he had never managed to win. He looked at himself in the square of mirror nailed to the cabin wall and saw 2 men staring back, the hermit and the fighter, the penitent and the predator, sharing the same scarred face, each one claiming the same pair of hands. He did not know which one would walk off this mountain. He locked the cabin door, which he had never done in 10 years because he was not certain he would return. The mountain released him slowly, reluctantly, the trees thinning around him like a crowd stepping back from something it does not want to touch. The air warmed. The sounds of the lowland replaced the high silence, birdsong, running water, the distant complaint of cattle. Every step downhill was a step toward the man he used to be. He moved through the forest like something native to it, his enormous frame somehow silent on the needles and loose stone, a shadow with weight. He reached Ridgewater at dusk. The town lay below the final ridge like a collection of wooden boxes arranged along a single line of dirt, a road flanked by false-fronted buildings, a church with a crooked steeple, a saloon leaking yellow light into the growing dark. He studied it from the tree line for 10 minutes, cataloging it the way a predator catalogs a clearing. The sheriff's office, small, neglected, irrelevant. The White House on the hill, Garrett's obviously, the only building that looked fed. The shack at the far edge of town, one candle burning in the window. That candle tightened his chest. It had been lit for him, not just tonight, every night for 9 years. Cora had been lighting that candle and watching the mountain and waiting for a shape that never appeared on the trail. And he had been 20 miles above, watching the same light, and neither of them had crossed the distance. Until now. He descended the ridge and walked to the shack and knocked. The door opened. Before his knuckles left the wood. Cora. Her face broke open, relief and grief hitting simultaneously, 9 years of both arriving in the same instant, like twin waves from opposite directions colliding in the center of her chest. She pulled him inside. Nettie was asleep in the corner. Josiah stood over his daughter and saw the bruise, fading now, purple and yellow, still shaped like fingers, still the size of a man's hand on the shoulder of a child. He touched it with a fingertip so gentle it barely displaced the air above her skin. He stood there for a full minute. Then he turned to Cora, his face calm, his voice level, his eyes incandescent. "Tell me everything." And she did. The dead chicken, the frozen credit, the school expulsion, the doubled rent, the women whispering, the men looking through her, the day on the road, the eggs, the blood, the silence of a town that watched a child bleed and chose its own comfort over her safety. Josiah absorbed it all without moving. His hands were steady. He noticed that, and the noticing frightened him, because steady meant the thing inside him was awake and focused. But it was the last thing Cora said that broke through every wall he had ever built. She stopped singing, Josiah. She used to sing to the chickens. She used to tell stories about the clouds and name the stars. She does not do that anymore. He did not just push her down. He pushed the music out of her. Josiah's fists closed so slowly and so completely that every scar across his knuckles turned white. That was the sentence. That was the fuse. At 8 o'clock the next morning, Josiah Calloway walked down the main road of Ridgewater and the town stopped functioning. He was the largest thing on the street by a margin that rearranged every sense of scale the town had ever established. His duster coat swept the dirt behind him like a storm arriving on foot. His boots struck the packed earth with a cadence that sounded like a second heartbeat the town had not known it needed. His beard was long and silver-streaked, his hair tied back, and his gray eyes moved across the buildings and faces with the flat, patient sweep of a man, identifying threats by habit rather than intention. The baker appeared in his window and forgot his own name. The schoolteacher gripped her porch railing as if the earth were tilting. 3 children pointed and were instantly pulled inside by mothers whose instincts had outrun their thoughts. A dog barked once, looked at Josiah, flattened to the ground, and pressed its chin into the dust with a whimper. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were boots, the creak of leather, and the wind rearranging itself around an obstacle it had not encountered before. Josiah did not slow down. He did not look at the crowd. He walked with the deliberate, measured stride of a man who has already decided what he is going to do and is simply covering the distance between the decision and the act. He entered the general store. The bell above the door produced a sound so inappropriately cheerful it belonged to a different morning in a different town. Willard Gant, the shopkeeper, looked up from his scales and turned the color of old milk. Josiah placed flour, coffee, honey, a bolt of blue fabric, and a bag of peppermint candy on the counter in a neat row. "These are for Cora Calloway. Open an account under the name Calloway." Willard produced the expected noises about credit policies and unknown customers. Josiah placed his hand flat on the counter. The wood groaned like a living thing in pain. Willard's eyes dropped to the knuckles, white scars crossing every ridge, each one a record of impact, a history of fists that had never lost an argument. "You've been shorting her flour for 3 years, Josiah said, his voice low and level as the bedrock beneath the building. "You've been overcharging her because a man told you to, and you lacked the spine to refuse. That arrangement ends this morning." Willard opened the account. The ink smeared because his hand could not stop trembling. He did not ask a single question. The knuckles had answered every one of them. By mid-morning, every person in Ridgewater knew. A giant had descended from the mountain, and he was looking for Garrett Slade. The rumors bred with the speed and recklessness of wildfire. Bounty hunter, fugitive, ghost, outlaw, avenging angel, the devil himself wearing elk hide. People clustered on porches, whispering at volumes that defeated the purpose of discretion. Sheriff Hicks sent his deputy to the saloon to warn Garrett. Garrett was at his usual table, morning whiskey, a plate of beef, 3 ranch hands arranged around him like set pieces in a performance of power. And he laughed. He laughed the loud, hard laugh of a man who has confused the absence of opposition with the presence of strength. "Let him come. I have been running this valley for 15 years. There is not a man alive I cannot buy, break, or bury." His men laughed because they were compensated to laugh. The bartender polished glass and held silence, because silence was included in his wages. But something had changed in the air, something Garrett could feel in his teeth and his fingertips, the way animals feel a change in barometric pressure before a storm they cannot see. The food chain had been rearranged. Garrett just did not know it yet. Josiah entered the saloon at noon. The doors swung wide and the light behind him turned his body into an eclipse, a man-shaped absence of brightness that was somehow more visible than everything it obscured. The piano stopped. The bartender's hand froze around the glass. Every head turned, and every body in the room went rigid with a recognition that predated language, the ancient cellular understanding that a predator had entered an enclosed space and the exits were behind it. Josiah walked to Garrett's table. He sat down. The chair protested. The table shifted. The whiskey in Garrett's glass developed a tremor. "My name is Josiah Calloway." The name struck the room like a hammer striking a bell. Calloway, the mountain woman's surname. Every man connected it simultaneously. Garrett's smirk collapsed. "I hear you put your hands on a child," Josiah said, quiet as deep water. "She is 8 years old, 52 pounds, and you drove her face into the road in front of a town too frightened of you to lift her up." Garrett's right eye twitched. His ranch hand's fingers drifted toward his hip. Josiah's gaze tracked the movement and dismissed it without his body shifting a single degree. That dismissal was more terrifying than any drawn weapon. "She was in my way," Garrett managed, his voice climbing to a register it had never visited in public. Josiah did not blink. "Tomorrow at sunrise, you will stand in the center of that road. You will kneel in the same dirt where my daughter fell. You will apologize to her, and to her mother in front of every soul in this town. Then you will sign over the water rights you have used to strangle this valley. That is your first option." Garrett's chair crashed backward as he stood. His men rose with him. Nobody stepped forward. The tell was obvious to every man in the room. "And the second?" Garrett asked, trying for steel and producing tin. Josiah stood, slowly, tectonically. He leaned forward until his scarred face was inches from Garrett's, close enough to smell pine sap and wood smoke and a decade of solitude. "The second option is that I stay. I do not leave. I watch you every single day. And the next time you do something cruel, and you will, because cruelty is the only fluency you possess, I will be standing directly behind you. And the last man who stood where you are standing right now did not get the opportunity to stand again." Josiah turned his back, walked out. Not one man moved to stop him. The silence he left behind lasted 90 seconds. Then Garrett sat down and poured whiskey over the table because his hands had forgotten how to find the glass. Garrett did not sleep. He paced the wide plank floors of his ranch house in a circuit so repetitive that by midnight the boards had begun to groan in a pattern as if the house itself were counting his laps. He consumed a bottle and a half of whiskey and registered nothing. The alcohol evaporated on contact with the acid fear churning through his system, burned away before it could reach whatever part of the brain is responsible for comfort. He sent 3 riders to the territorial marshal demanding an arrest warrant. They returned at midnight with the marshal's verdict. A man asked you to apologize to a child you assaulted? I believe the word for that is justice. Garrett hurled a kerosene lantern at the parlor wall. It shattered. The curtain caught fire. Polk, his foreman, stamped the flame out with his boot and said nothing. The ranch hands watched from the hallway, their faces performing the same calculation. How far could a good horse travel before sunrise? And was Garrett Slade's money still worth what it was going to cost to earn it? Polk broke the silence at 2 a.m. He was the longest-serving hand on the payroll. 12 years of dirty work performed without hesitation or conscience because the pay was excellent and morality was a luxury he had never been able to afford. But Polk was also 53 years old in a territory that buried most men before 40, and he had reached that age by developing a precise instinct for the moment when loyalty became indistinguishable from suicide. He came to Garrett with his hat in his hands and his saddlebags already on his horse. I have spent 30 years in this country, boss. The man who sat across from you today, I have heard of someone who matches that description. The territories had a name for him. People only used it in whispers, and only when they were certain he was not within earshot. He walked into a creek bed with 3 armed men and walked out alone, and what he left behind was not recognizable as human. Garrett told Polk to shut his mouth. Polk settled his hat on his head. You have 1 move left. I suggest you use it before sunrise. He walked out. By 3 o'clock, every hand on the payroll had packed their belongings and ridden into the dark without looking back at the White House on the hill. At 4 a.m, Garrett tried to run. He threw a saddle on his fastest horse, spurred it toward the south road, and made it 200 yards before the animal planted its hooves and refused to move. It stood trembling in the road, ears flat, nostrils flared, staring at the tree line with the fixed terror of a creature that has detected something its rider cannot see. Garrett kicked, cursed, whipped. The horse would not budge, and then Garrett saw it, a shape in the darkness between the pines, massive, still, standing with the patience of something that has nowhere else to be. He could not see the face. He did not need to. The shape was enough. Josiah had said he would stay, and Josiah had meant it the way gravity means it when it pulls you toward the ground, not as a threat, but as a law. Garrett wrenched the horse around and galloped back to the ranch house. He locked every door. He loaded every gun in the building and arranged them on the dining table like a display in a museum dedicated to futility. Then he sat down in the empty house, surrounded by weapons that could not help him and silence that used to belong to other people. And he understood. His men were gone. His authority was gone. His bluff had been called by someone who was not bluffing. At 5 a.m, Garrett Slade put his head on the dining table and wept. The sobs came from somewhere below his stomach, from a place he did not know existed, a basement in his own body where every cruelty he had ever committed had been stored and cataloged and was now being audited simultaneously. He did not weep for Nettie. He did not weep for Cora. He did not weep for the widows he had swindled, or the families he had starved, or the lives he had crushed with the indifferent efficiency of a boot on an insect. He wept for himself. Because the empire he had built, the water, the land, the sheriff, the judge, the fear, had disintegrated in 24 hours. Not because Josiah had harmed him, because Josiah had not needed to. That was the revelation that gutted him. His power had never been real. It had been a shared fiction, a story the town told itself because telling it was easier than challenging it. One man had walked into his saloon and spoken quietly, and the entire fiction had evaporated like mist in direct sunlight. Garrett's kingdom was made of the same material as every bully's kingdom throughout history, other people's silence. Dawn crept over the ridge like a slow gray tide. Mist rolled through Ridgewater, blurring the edges of buildings, turning the main road into something spectral and provisional. By first light, the town had already gathered. Every soul in Ridgewater positioned along the road, on porches, on fence posts, in windows, a congregation assembled for a ceremony that had no name but that everyone understood. The baker stood in his flour-dusted apron. The schoolteacher pressed her Bible to her chest. Sheriff Hicks waited outside his office with the complexion of a man attending his own sentencing. At the center of the road stood Cora and Nettie. Cora had washed and pressed the white dress through the night. She had brushed Nettie's hair until it shone and tied it with a blue ribbon cut from the fabric Josiah had bought. The bruise was fading, but still visible above the collar, yellow at the edges, still mapped with the ghost of fingers. Behind them, Josiah stood with his arms at his sides, still as the granite he had lived among for a decade. At the far end of the road, Garrett appeared. On foot. Alone. No horse, no men, no hat. His shirt untucked, his face the color of ash, walking toward the center of the road on legs that had already surrendered. The mist clung to Garrett's boots as he walked, and the town held its breath with such totality that the silence became a physical presence, a pressure that sat on every rooftop and pressed against every window and wrapped around every person along that road, like a bandage being tightened around a wound that the whole town had been pretending did not exist. Garrett Slade, the man who had controlled Ridgewater for 15 years, who owned the water and the land and the law and the fear, was walking alone and unarmed down the center of the main road toward an 8-year-old girl in a white dress. Every person watching understood that what was about to happen would split time in this town into 2 eras, everything before this morning and everything after. His boots dragged in the dirt. His arms hung at his sides like ropes cut from a scaffold. His face held the expression of a man who has exhausted every currency he ever possessed, money, threats, leverage, bluster, and has been left with nothing but the terrifying poverty of his own undecorated self. He did not look at the crowd. He could not. Every face was a mirror, and every mirror reflected the same image. A bully stripped of his stage, a tyrant without his army, a man constructed entirely of other people's fear, walking toward a child who was not afraid. Cora stood behind Nettie with both hands on her daughter's shoulders. She was trembling, but not from fear, from the monumental effort of holding still while every nerve ending in her body demanded that she either run or attack. She did neither. She stood. She waited. She gave her daughter the space to face the man who had hurt her, because Cora understood something that most people spend their entire lives failing to learn. Healing does not come from the absence of the wound. It comes from standing in front of the thing that made it and discovering that you are still whole. Nettie stood in her clean white dress with her brushed hair and her blue ribbon and the fading map of a man's fingers on her shoulder, and she watched Garrett approach with her father's eyes, gray, level, depthless. She was not performing bravery. She was not pretending to be unafraid. She was genuinely, completely calm, and that calm radiated outward from her small body like heat from a stone that has been sitting in the sun all day. She had her mother's spine and her father's stillness, and together those qualities produced something that Garrett had never encountered in his entire life, a person who saw him clearly and did not flinch. Garrett stopped 5 feet from Nettie. The distance was the width of a dining table, the length of a coffin, the exact measure of space in which a man's entire identity can collapse and reassemble into something unrecognizable. He looked at the girl, and whatever was left of the character he had constructed, the rancher, the boss, the self-appointed king of a valley full of frightened people, fell away from him like dead bark stripped from a tree by wind. He saw her. He saw the split in her lip, healed now to a thread-thin line that only her mother would normally notice, but that he, in this annihilating moment, saw with the clarity of a man seeing his own reflection for the first time. He saw the bruise, his bruise, made by his hand, pressed into the body of a child who had been carrying eggs. He saw what that bruise meant, not just pain, but education. He had taught an 8-year-old girl that the world was a place where powerful people hurt powerless people and no one intervenes. He had written that lesson into her skin. And the lesson was still legible. And the whole town was reading it. And for the first time in his life, Garrett understood that cruelty is not powerful. Cruelty is a confession of weakness written in someone else's pain. He dropped to his knees. The impact sent a small cloud of dust into the air, the same dust that had filled Nettie's eyes and mouth, the same dust that had absorbed her blood, the same dust that had witnessed every cruelty Ridgewater had swallowed for 15 years. His knees sank into it, his hands fell open at his sides, his head dropped. When he spoke, his voice was unrecognizable, not the voice of the man who had commanded this valley, but the stripped, cracked, naked voice of a man who had run out of masks. "I am sorry," he said. The second word broke in half. "I am sorry for what I did to you." He raised his eyes to Cora. They were red, wet, emptied of everything except the raw fact of what he was. "And I am sorry for what I did to your mother." The schoolteacher bowed her head. The baker stepped off his porch and into the road, the first person to enter it since the day. Nettie fell, reclaiming the ground he had surrendered with his silence. A woman in the crowd pressed her hand to her mouth and began to cry, not for Garrett, but for the years she had spent pretending this kind of mourning was impossible. Then Nettie stepped forward. One step, two. She stopped in front of the kneeling man, the man who had humiliated her, who had silenced her songs, who had taught her at 8 years old that the world punishes the small for the convenience of the large. And she reached out her hand. She placed it on the top of his bowed head. Gently. Not with forgiveness as a concept, but with forgiveness as an action, specific, physical, deliberate, the way her father placed his hand on her bruise, barely touching but meaning everything. Garrett flinched as if her fingers carried voltage. Then he came apart. His shoulders shook. His head dropped lower. His body produced sounds that did not resemble anything the town had ever heard from a man of his size, and station, broken, animal, stripped of all pretense. And behind Nettie, Josiah Calloway, the man who could have dismantled Garrett with his bare hands, the man who had come down the mountain carrying enough rage to burn the whole valley to the ground, stood perfectly still, with tears running into his beard in 2 silent tracks. Because his daughter had just done the one thing he could never have done. She had met cruelty with grace. She had answered violence with an open hand. And that, more than any fist or threat, was the thing that cracked Ridgewater open and let the light pour through. Garrett signed the document at 9 o'clock in the general store, seated at a table with Willard Gant and 14 witnesses who had walked in voluntarily, not because anyone had summoned them, but because they wanted to watch ink rewrite the future of their valley. The paper transferred control of the year-round spring and all its tributaries to a communal trust governed by the farmers and ranchers of Ridgewater. Josiah had written the terms himself in rough handwriting that left no room for interpretation. Equal access, shared maintenance, no single owner, no exceptions, no reversals, no amendments without unanimous consent. Garrett's hand shook so severely that the ink bled at the edges of his signature, feathering outward like a bruise. But the name was legible. And when the pen lifted from the paper, something shifted in the room that was larger than water rights or land deeds or the transfer of a resource. It was permission. Quiet, collective, unspoken permission to stop being afraid. The shopkeeper added an extra pound of flour to Cora's account without being asked. The schoolteacher left a note at the shack inviting Nettie back to class. The deputy turned in his badge at noon and rode out of Ridgewater by sundown, and nobody asked where he was going because nobody cared. But it was Nettie's first morning back at school that proved the town had truly changed. She walked through the door of the schoolhouse in her blue ribbon and sat in the front row and folded her hands on the desk the way her mother had taught her. Back straight, chin level, eyes forward. The room went quiet. 17 children stared at the girl they had been told was a disruption, the girl whose mother was a scandal, the girl who had been erased from their classroom by a man who controlled their parents' water. The teacher, a woman named Mrs. Pruitt, who had not protested the expulsion, because protesting required a courage she did not possess at the time, walked to Nettie's desk and placed a brand new slate and a piece of chalk in front of her. "Welcome back, Nettie," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were wet. Nettie picked up the chalk. She wrote her name at the top of the slate in careful, deliberate letters. Then she looked up and waited for the lesson to begin. A boy in the second row, Orville, the same boy whose nose she had broken 2 years earlier, leaned forward and whispered, "I saved your seat." Nettie looked at him, and for the first time since the day in the road, she smiled. Cora's life rebuilt itself with the patient, irreversible momentum of a season turning. The general store sold to her at honest weights. The women who had whispered for 9 years began to nod, then wave, then stop on the road and speak in the stilted, cautious sentences of people who know they behaved badly and have not yet found the language for apology. Cora accepted each small gesture without comment, the way you accept rain after a drought, gratefully, without pretending it erases what the dry years cost. She opened a bakery in the front room of the shack, working a sourdough starter she had been feeding for 3 years. The bread was extraordinary, dark-crusted, tangy, dense enough to sustain a working man through a full day, and tender enough to eat with nothing but butter and silence. Word spread beyond. Ridgewater. Ranchers rode in from neighboring valleys. The baker across the street, rather than resenting the competition, improved his own recipes, and the rivalry made both of them better, and the town ate better bread than it had ever eaten. And something about that, about the simple daily act of a woman providing nourishment to a place that had tried to starve her, rewrote the story of Ridgewater more thoroughly than any signature on any document ever could. Garrett withdrew into the White House on the hill and became a ghost haunting his own architecture. Over the following weeks, he sold land back to the families he had taken it from. The Mercer acres returned to Elda's daughter, the Dunlap pasture restored, the Orozco grazing rights reinstated, at prices that were not generous, but were no longer predatory. He stopped coming to town. He stopped sitting at his saloon table. The house with the green shutters and the wraparound porch, which had once radiated authority, the way a furnace radiates heat, now looked like what it had always been, an oversized building occupied by an undersized man who had mistaken square footage for stature. Some people in Ridgewater felt sorry for him. Most did not. Nettie never mentioned his name again. She did not need to. She had already done the most powerful thing anyone had ever done to Garrett Slade. She had touched his head while he knelt in the dirt and shown him, and the entire town, that an 8-year-old girl with a bruise on her shoulder possessed more strength than a man who had controlled a valley for 15 years. Not the strength of muscle or money or fear. The strength of a hand that opens when every instinct says to make a fist. Josiah tried to stay. He tried for 3 days, sleeping in Cora's shack, walking the town road, nodding at people who nodded at him. But the walls pressed inward. Every raised voice made his hands clench. Every slammed door sent a jolt through his chest where the old violence slept with one eye open, dormant but listening, ready. He could not risk it, not here, not near Nettie. So he built a new cabin at the timberline, halfway between the summit and the town, where the wild met the human world in a border zone of tall pines and creek crossings. Close enough that Nettie could reach him in half a day's walk. Close enough that he could see the town's lights on clear nights, small and warm against the dark. Close enough that if Cora ever placed 2 candles in her window instead of 1, their signal, older than language, meaning, "Come now," he could be there before the sun crossed the first ridge. He would never live in town. But he would never again live only for himself. The distance between those 2 truths was exactly the width of a mountain trail that an 8-year-old girl in a blue ribbon could walk on a Sunday morning carrying bread. Every Sunday, Nettie climbed the mountain. She followed the trail that wound through the pines and crossed the creek at the place where the water ran clear over smooth stones, and the light came through the canopy in shafts so sharp they looked solid enough to hold. She carried a loaf of sourdough from Cora's bakery, still warm, wrapped in the same blue cloth her ribbon had been cut from. She carried stories from school, who said what at recess, who brought a toad to arithmetic, who tripped in the mud and blamed the mud for being in the wrong place. She carried questions that only Josiah could answer. Why do elk shed their antlers in spring? How do you know which clouds carry snow and which ones are bluffing? Why does the creek sound different before a storm? And she carried something she was too young to name, but that settled into her body like warmth, the knowledge that she was walking toward the one place where every part of her was welcome. Not just the parts that the world approved of, all of her, the stubbornness, the silence, the gray eyes that saw too much, the fist that had broken Orville's nose. All of it welcomed, all of it home. Josiah was always on the porch, rain, snow, wind, the crystalline cold of a January morning when the air hurt to breathe. He was there, a fire already built, water already boiling, his face arranged in an expression Nettie had learned to read the way her mother read weather. The slight lift at the corner of his eyebrows when something pleased him. The deepening of the lines around his eyes when pride swelled too large for his voice to carry. The way his entire body seemed to settle when she appeared at the edge of the meadow, every muscle releasing a tension she had not realized he was holding until she watched it leave. He never ran to meet her. He never called out or waved. He stood and watched her come with the patience of a man who understood that the best things in life arrive at their own pace and are ruined by rushing. When she reached the porch, he would say 2 words. "There you are." They sounded like a complete sentence. They sounded like a man saying, "I have been waiting for you since before you existed, and I will wait for you after I am gone, and everything in between is borrowed time that I intend to spend wisely." He taught her the mountain the way the mountain had taught him, not through instruction, but through proximity, through the slow absorption of knowledge that happens when 2 people sit together in the same silence and look at the same thing long enough for the thing to start speaking. He showed her how to track elk through fresh snow by reading the depth and angle of the prints, how to predict a storm 3 hours out by watching which direction the birds abandoned, how to build a fire in rain using dead bark stripped from the underside of a fallen pine, the one place where wood stays dry when the world above it is drowning, how to sit still. Not the restless stillness of waiting, but the deep-rooted stillness of arrival, the feeling of being in the exact right place at the exact right time, with nothing to fix and nothing to flee. Nettie absorbed these lessons the way soil absorbs rain, invisibly, completely, transforming them into something living the moment they entered her. Some Sundays, they talked for hours. Some Sundays, they spoke fewer than 20 words, and the silence between them was so comfortable, it felt like a third person sitting on the porch, someone they both loved and did not need to entertain. One evening, late in the first autumn after the day in the road, they sat on the porch watching the sun perform its nightly disappearance behind the western ridge. The sky was doing the thing it does only at elevation, turning colors that do not exist in the lowlands, shades of amber and violet, and a deep wounded red that looked like the atmosphere itself was healing from something it refused to name. The valley below was gold where the light still touched it, and blue where the shadows had begun to claim it. Elk moved across the far meadow in single file, their antlers catching the last light like candelabras carried through a darkening church. A raven called from the cliff above the cabin, and another answered from the trees, and the 2 sounds braided together and faded into the wind. Nettie was leaning against Josiah's arm, her small body pressed against his massive one, her head barely reaching his shoulder. The bread was eaten. The fire was low. The world was doing the thing it does at the end of certain rare days, going quiet and gold and still, as if it has decided, just for this moment, to stop breaking things and simply hold them instead. "Papa," Nettie said, "are you happy?" Josiah did not answer immediately. He looked at the valley. He looked at the mountain. He looked at the sky, which was now the color of every bruise he had ever inflicted and every bruise he had ever received, all of them healing simultaneously, all of them fading toward something that was not forgiveness exactly, but was in the same territory. He thought about the man he had been, the fighter who stood in a red creek with steady hands and no regret. He thought about the man he had tried to become, the hermit who called silence a cure and solitude a sacrament. And he thought about the man he was now, sitting on a porch with his daughter's warmth against his arm and her bread in his stomach and her question hanging in the mountain air like a bell that had been struck and was still ringing. This man was neither of those earlier versions. This man had been built by a letter and a bruise, and a walk down a mountain, and a girl who placed her hand on a broken man's head and showed an entire town what strength looks like when it has nothing to prove. Josiah pulled Nettie close. He pressed his lips to the top of her head the way he had the night she was born. "I was not," he said, "but you taught me how." The mountain stood behind them, ancient and unhurried. The valley stretched below, gold dissolving into silver. And they stayed on that porch until the stars came out, first 1, then 10, then so many the sky looked like it was keeping a record of every good thing that had ever happened in the world and refusing to let a single one go dark.